Last week, a new film came out featuring our own Julian Assange. What do you think of it?
The film is called We Steal Secrets, the story of Wikileaks. And it's a film by a well-known director, Alex Gibney, who actually won an Academy Award for an important film called Taxi to the Dark Side. Unfortunately, this film about WikiLeaks, Bradley Manning, and Julian Assange is a great disappointment, does a disservice to Bradley Manning and Julian Assange, as well as WikiLeaks. I think trivializes the incredible courage that both of them had, as well as what was revealed by these documents, both from Bradley Manning and Julian Assange. And when you say, Heidi, it features Julian Assange, it unfortunately doesn't feature Julian Assange, or maybe fortunately, considering the kind of what many would call a hatchet job that Gibney did on this film. Julian Assange declined being interviewed by Alex Gibney, and that may be what gave Alex Gibney an edge about how he dealt with Julian Assange in the film. Alex was well funded for the film, but he didn't get an interview with anybody who is currently associated with WikiLeaks, including Julian Assange. And so this film doesn't really speak to what Julian Assange thinks or is about, and obviously he didn't get an interview with Bradley Manning.
The other third person who's facing prison time is Jeremy Hammond for hacking into Stratfor and uploading to WikiLeaks. Was he mentioned in the film?
I don't think he's mentioned in the film. It was really mostly, as the title says, We Steal Secrets, the story of WikiLeaks. But let me just give you some of my observations on the film. I saw it in Sundance a couple of months ago. It was released on Friday, the 24th of May, and it'll be interesting to see what people think about the film. But the first thing that grabs you immediately is the title. We Steal Secrets, the story of WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks, as we all understand, is a publisher. It is not the organization, neither is Julian Assange, the person who took documents from the government when they supposedly had a security clearance. He's a publisher like the New York Times, like any other newspaper. And yet the film is entitled We Steal Secrets, the story of WikiLeaks. The implication is clear from that title, it seems to me, that WikiLeaks stole secrets. That's very bad for WikiLeaks or for Julian Assange, because it plays into the government's theory here that somehow Julian Assange and WikiLeaks are co-conspirators with Bradley Manning in taking secrets.
And you know, Michael, this is actually quite timely because a Fox reporter has just been accused of conspiring with a source. I believe this is the first time the government, although it's gone after whistleblowers and tried to find source material, it's the first time I think that the government has accused a journalist of conspiring in terms of trying to bring materials out. So it seems kind of a disturbing trend.
I want to talk about that, Heidi. It's the Rosen case,
right.
And it's a Fox News reporter, and it's very important to talk about that. Before I do that, I want to talk about a couple of other points with regard to the implications that Julian Assange is someone who stole secrets. First is the title. Then there's two or three other places in the film where he again has that implication. Another place is where he says, and I'll read from what we took when we were at the film, the words of it. Here's what it says in the film. In this environment of expanding secrecy, Assange went fishing for secrets to publish. To bait whistleblowers, he published a list of the most wanted leaks. So in that one phrase, it says, Assange went fishing for secrets, and then he published a list of leaks he wanted. So it's implying that he solicited and pushed for what he was getting. And that'll get to the Rosen case. But it's already moving Assange from a publisher into somebody who's a co-conspirator and an aiding and abetter. And then he also says in the film, but in online chats with WikiLeaks, Manning's thoughts changed. Either he decided or he was persuaded that he should capture more flags, a lot more flags, referring to secrets. In other words, Julian Assange or somebody at WikiLeaks persuaded Manning. So you have We Steal Secrets, fishing, bait, and then persuaded. And then you have the government saying early on in the WikiLeaks revelations, saying that, well, we think by having that website, etc., Julian Assange was soliciting, and that may cross the line into aiding and abetting espionage, essentially, they said. And then it comes to the Rosen case. The Rosen case, a reporter for Fox News, a document surfaced within the last week or so that said that, yes, we're investigating who Rosen's sources were, and one of the things they did apparently to get the search warrant or to get whatever court order they got to get in, look at his I guess, his phone logs, they said Rosen conceivably aiding and abetting espionage or a conspiracy to commit espionage. So here you have exactly what we feared was happening with publishers like Wikileaks and Julian Assange. And we have open evidence that they're doing this to a reporter at Fox News. And what is shocking about this are two things. One is, of course, Fox News is now up in arms about it. But, of course, they were one of the news organizations that went after Julian Assange in the worst way, saying he should be 6 foot underground, he should be droned to death, etc. And, of course, now everybody should stand up for Rosen, as they should be standing up for WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. Because as soon as you start saying that let's take another example, James Risen at the New York Times. 4 years ago or 6 years ago, he publishes material about the warrantless wiretapping that is being carried on by the National Security Archives. I don't know how he got that information, but I presume it wasn't just dropped in the mail to the New York Times. He probably knew people at the National Security Agency. He talks to them. I don't know whether he says, "What do you have for me?" I don't know what he says.
He's an investigative journalist. He was doing his job.
Exactly right. So as soon as you put investigative journalists into the category of co-conspirators or aiders and abettors, whether it's James Risen or Julian Assange or Rosen, you're basically saying that's the end of investigative journalism. And with regard to the Department of Defense and war, that's the only way any information comes out about war in this country, about weapons, because everything is considered secret, everything. Back to the film. So We Steal Secrets, the story of WikiLeaks, is already putting Julian Assange in a place where the government would love to put him. So that's one of my very major criticisms of the film. A second aspect of the film is Bradley Manning. Oftentimes, the film uses rhetorical questions that Gibney, as narrator, sets out, and really contained within them is the answer of where he's going with the question, and then he proves that. So with regard to Bradley Manning, he talks about Bradley Manning's motivation for leaking these hundreds of thousands of documents. And he goes through the film saying, was it political or was it because of all his problems? And here's the way he asked the question, and there's other places as well. Just what had happened with Bradley Manning? Was this just a data dump? Or was this the act of a man who had peeked behind the curtain of a superpower and decided what it was doing was wrong? And then he goes into the motivations of Bradley Manning, and he spends a significant part of the film on all of Bradley Manning's psychological problems, his gender issues, and everything else. I don't know what he's done with this latest version. I saw, maybe it's the same one I saw, but I don't know what he's done with the incredible statement by Bradley Manning on the political basis for what he did.
Bradley Manning's statement in the court.
That's right. The one where he went through each set of documents and said, I did this because I didn't like seeing people murdered in the collateral murder video. I didn't like seeing us targeting people in Iraq.
He laid out the moral grounds for all of this. Laid out the
moral and political grounds for it. And yet the film goes through a lot of this stuff around this gender and issues of that came out at the pre-trial, but that actually all came out and happened to Bradley after he had actually given this material to WikiLeaks. In that context, Gibney has given some interviews since the film because he knows his position is going to be controversial, but he doesn't pull back. So here's what he says in an interview in the Daily Beast about Bradley Manning. I think he was alienated. He was in agony personally over a number of issues. He was lonely and needy, had an identity crisis, etc. And then this is all Gibney speaking. And then he says, I think it raises big issues about who whistleblowers are, because they are alienated people who don't get along with people around them, which motivates them to do what they do. This is Alex Gibney speaking to the Daily Beast. Well, when people do things, it's obviously complex. All of us, you could probably go from Martin Luther King to George Washington and the cherry tree and come up with different motivations why different people act. But in this case, Gibney is giving an opinion that it's the personal identity crisis that he's supposedly going through that gave him the impetus to release all these documents. Pretty outrageous position and pretty demeaning, in my view, of the real motivation that Bradley Manning himself put forward for why he did this.
It's akin to an ad hominem attack and not addressing the substance.
I just want to give a few other points in the film. A third point in the film is he basically says WikiLeaks is dead, that it was killed by Julian Assange and what he calls Julian Assange's corruption. and he goes through whatever he thinks. It doesn't mean financial, because there doesn't seem to be anything around that, but just what he calls his corruption. And he basically says he killed WikiLeaks and it's dead. And of course, what killed WikiLeaks? It's not killed, let's start there. So he's wrong about it being killed, and I'll address that. But to the extent it had problems, it's because the U.S. was so upset and angry about what happened. So they encouraged the cutting off of all the, and PayPal went ahead and MasterCard to cut off all its financial resources. They started a criminal grand jury investigation.
They launched a full-scale attack.
Yeah, a full-scale attack. They started going after his supporters, etc. So if we're going to talk about what hurt WikiLeaks, it's not the figure of Julian Assange. It's what the U.S. government has done. But the idea, he says in the film, and when he speaks of it being dead, WikiLeaks, despite that special relationship, talking about a matter with Sweden or something, Assange desperately fought extradition to Sweden and lost every appeal. His legal battle drained his finances and trapped him at the family farm over a year. Hoped-for funding didn't come, and WikiLeaks suspended operation. His international organization had blown apart. Let's just look at what's happened. Since that, what has WikiLeaks done? It's done incredible work. Since December 2011, they released what are called the spy files, which are the companies and corporations that sell spying equipment all over the world, surveillance equipment. They released the Stratfor emails, 5 million emails, not all yet released, but being released periodically, of a private intelligence company that had amazing material in them. They're dubbed the GIF files, GIF files. The Syria files, the emails about what was going on in Syria. And in April 2013, what we call Cablegate, or the Kissinger files, 1.7 million files, highly searchable, about what happened when Kissinger was both head of, I think he was at that point, he was both State Department as well as National Security Advisor, 73 to 76. So this is an organization the film Gibney calls dead, and yet it's as active as I've ever seen. So one of the things that Alex has to prove in this film to prove his thesis is that Julian is in that embassy in Ecuador, in London, because he's afraid of going to Sweden, because he doesn't want to answer questions about the allegations of sexual misconduct in Sweden. Now, Julian has offered to answer those questions. He doesn't want to go to Sweden to do that because he knows, and I know, that that's a one-way ticket to the United States, where there's a serious effort to prosecute him. And he will probably spend the rest of his life in prison here, if convicted. So what he has to do to be able to prove that is diminish the prospect for prosecution of Julian Assange in the United States. It's ridiculous. I mean, there's everything going on from a grand jury, likely indictment, Stratfor saying in one of the documents that there's a sealed indictment against Julian, to his associates and friends being picked up. But here's what it says in the film. The biggest mystery of all was the role of the United States. He calls it a mystery. Over 2 years after the first leak, no charges had been filed by the U.S. Assange claimed that the U.S. was biding his time, waiting for him to go to Sweden, but there was no proof. So there's three things in that one sentence in which Gibney is trying to prove that he's in that embassy to avoid Sweden, but there's no worry about the United States, or it's just complete speculation. Mystery, no charges, and biding his time. Well, there's no mystery about the United States. It's all public record. The grand jury we know about, the witnesses called, we know a number of them. We know which associates have been stopped. We know subpoenas have been issued to Twitter and Google, etc. We know at the Bradley Manning trial, they said they were investigating the leading officers, etc., of WikiLeaks. And as late as a couple of months ago, on March 26, 2013, they confirmed that they have a continuing investigation, criminal investigation of WikiLeaks. So there's no mystery. Then this statement that somehow Gibney knows there's no charges filed against Julian Assange. How does he know that? It's a secret grand jury, and if there's an indictment, it's going to be a sealed indictment, because they never let an indictment become public when a person is not in their custody, because then the person will never get to a place where they can grab them. So how Gibney knows that there's no charges, the answer is he doesn't know. He's doing a rhetorical device to simply try and say, oh, Julian Assange has nothing to fear. It's all paranoia that there might be charges against him. So again, completely disingenuous. Then he says there's no proof that the U.S. was biding its time in waiting to actually start an extradition proceeding against Julian Assange in releasing the indictment. Despite his statement that there's no proof the U.S. was biding its time, the U.S. actually said it was biding its time. They said that on BBC in 2011 that they'd wait to see what happened in Sweden, and that was revealed recently again that they were waiting to see the outcome of the other charges before they actually did anything to get a hold of Julian Assange. From a legal perspective, that makes sense, because if they were to file another extradition while the first one is pending to Sweden, then the court is put in a pickle of which one to honor first and what it does. And as long as the U.S. has him, or they thought they had him, under surveillance or with an ankle bracelet on in the UK, they figured, why worry about it? He was then have to go to Sweden. But now they're not in that situation, but he still is in the Ecuador embassy where he can't leave. So Gibney purposely lessens any kind of possibility of criminal charges against Julian in the United States to try and argue that he's paranoid or that he's just trying to avoid going to Sweden. It's, again, I would say, a complete misunderstanding, not the true story of what's going on.
It sounds as though you're saying this is an irresponsibly produced film, Michael.
Well, I would say this. It's a very unfair film to Julian Assange and Bradley Manning. It's filled with omissions, with
speculation.
It's filled with omissions, speculation, trivializes what was done by Manning and Assange by trying to focus on what I think is a false picture of their personal lives or their motivations. So it therefore trivializes the larger picture. It's actually shocking that someone of what I thought was someone who had done a film like Taxi to the Dark Side would do something to this on what I consider to be one of the most important political issues of our time.
What he's done, to the extent that public opinion can protect Julian Assange here in the United States, what he's done is he's whittled away at that support of public opinion and greased the skids for Julian Assange. And I would say that that's worse than irresponsible.
To the extent anybody sees this film, and I don't recommend it, see it with your eyes wide open. See it after you listen to this, if you're going to see it at all, and after a number of people, I think, will write a decent analysis of what this film really is about. In fact, part of the film, of course, has some of the good stuff they did. He sort of Gibney builds up what Manning and Assange did in the beginning to show they revealed some important material, and he does that almost to then sort of demean them toward the latter part of the film.
So that's 3 thumbs down.